The word blond literally meant white head in Proto-Germanic, not golden, not yellow, white, and it is connected to the word blend in a way that changes how you see both words forever. To understand why this matters, you have to put yourself in Northern Europe around the 5th and 6th centuries. Germanic tribes are moving across the continent. Languages are splitting, merging, borrowing from each other. The people speaking Proto-Germanic are not thinking about hair color the way we do today. They are thinking about light, about brightness, about what it means for something to be radiant versus dark, luminous versus shadowed. In this world, the distinction between white and bright is almost non-existent. The Old English word hwit, which gives us our modern word white, meant not just the color, but the quality of radiating light. Something hwit was clear, fair, glowing. Think of sunlight on snow, or the pale sky just before dawn. That is, the visual world these words were born into. Color and light were the same concept, described by the same words. Origin story. 3 men. So, where does blond actually come from? The trail leads back to Proto-Germanic blundaz, a reconstructed root that linguists believe originally described something like a white or luminous head. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting because blundaz is not just the ancestor of blonde. It is almost certainly a cognate of the word blend, as in mixing things together. The connection is this. The Proto-Indo-European root underlying both words carries the sense of mixing light, of combining brightness in a way that produces something pale, washed out, luminous. When you blend colors toward white, you're doing linguistically exactly what Proto-Germanic speakers were describing when they called someone blundaz. Now, we have to be clear about what the word was describing. The modern assumption is that blonde has always referred specifically to hair color, but the evidence suggests the original term described the scalp, the whole head, the pale appearance of the top of a person. The head in white head was literal. This is a word that came from observing how light reflected off a person, not just from categorizing their hair pigment. The word enters recorded English history through a winding path. Old English had hwit doing a lot of this work already, covering brightness, fairness, and pallor. But as French-influenced vocabulary flooded into Middle English after the Norman conquest of 1066, the word blonde arrived from Old French, where it had already absorbed this Germanic root. The French blonde carried the same pale, luminous connotation, applied now more specifically to hair and complexion. The surname white is one of the oldest surnames in the English language, and it was originally given to people with fair hair or complexion, tracking exactly the same conceptual territory as blonde. A person called white in the 11th or 12th century was being described with the Old English hwit, the same brightness root that feeds into this whole story. By the time the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086 under William the Conqueror, surnames derived from hwit were already well established across England, which tells you how central this idea of luminous fairness was to how people identified and described each other. The word white itself, as a color term in the modern sense, traces directly through Middle English wit from Old English hwit, and further back to Proto-Germanic kweit, which connects to the Proto-Indo-European root kweit, meaning to shine. Kenneth Brannock Watkins, the great American linguist whose work on Indo-European roots shaped how scholars approach these etymologies, traced this root carefully, showing how shining and white were functionally the same description at the deepest level of the language. The earliest recorded use of blonde, in the sense we now use it in English, is documented from 1967, which seems almost impossibly recent until you understand that dictionaries and linguistic records capture formal written usage, not the centuries of spoken and informal written use that preceded it. The Misconception, 90s. Here is where most people go wrong. When we hear blonde, we imagine a precise hair color, a specific shade somewhere between yellow and light brown, the kind of thing a colorist at a salon would name with a number. That is a modern, commercial, highly specific reading of a word that originally operated on a completely different register. The misconception is that blonde was always a hair color term. It was not. Proto-Germanic blundaz described a quality of luminous paleness associated with the head as a whole, the scalp, the face, the overall appearance of someone whose coloring was light and radiant. Hair was part of that picture, but only part. The deeper mistake is assuming the color term is primary and the light quality is secondary. It is exactly backwards. In the linguistic tradition that produced this word, brightness came first. The color was downstream of that. You were white-headed because you shone, because you reflected light, because you were pale and radiant in the way that early Northern Europeans associated with a certain kind of appearance. The color category blonde crystallized much later, once language started doing more precise pigment sorting work. Modern echoes, 90s. This ancient sense of luminosity has not entirely disappeared. It surfaces in ways that are easy to miss. When a photographer talks about blonde light, they mean diffuse, soft, whitish light, the kind that washes out contrast and creates an overall pallor in an image. That usage is closer to the original Proto-Germanic meaning than anything in a shampoo advertisement. The word blend carries a ghost of the same root every time we talk about blending toward white or blending light sources together. Paint mixed toward white gets lighter, more luminous, more blonde in the original sense. The vocabulary of light mixing in cinematography and painting is quietly haunted by this Proto-Germanic idea of luminosity as the thing being described, and surnames still carry it. White, Whitehead, Blount, a variant that came into English from the same French blonde root. All of these names encode the original idea of someone who was pale-headed, radiant-faced, described by their light-reflecting quality rather than a precise pigment category. Deeper connections. Two men dabes, pull back further and the connections multiply. The Proto-Indo-European root kweit, meaning to shine, is remarkably productive. It feeds into the Slavic languages too, giving Russian tevet, meaning color or flower, and the word for white in several Slavic branches. The idea that whiteness and shininess and flowering are all versions of the same fundamental quality is encoded deep in the Indo-European language family. In Old Norse, the related root produces words for brightness and clarity that feed into the Scandinavian languages. In Gothic, one of the earliest attested Germanic languages, similar roots describe luminosity and pallor together without distinguishing sharply between them. The cultural impact of all this is significant. These were not neutral descriptions. Calling someone hwit or blundaz in early medieval Northern Europe was placing them in a category of people associated with light, with visibility, with a certain kind of presence. Names derived from these roots were often given to people who stood out, who were notable for their appearance. The Whitehead family names that appear in medieval English records were not just describing a physical feature. They were marking a person as visually distinctive in a world where most people shared similar coloring. There is also the connection to the word bland, which shares a root neighborhood with blonde and blend. Bland, in its earliest uses, meant smooth and soft, mixed to evenness without sharp contrasts. The sense of blending toward a middle, luminous, undifferentiated quality runs through all of these words like a thread. What you have here is